Hey everybody, welcome to our second Python class of our hackathon pre-event series, leading up to all of the work everyone's been doing in their different groups and working towards our presentations on Saturday. So today we are building HTTP APIs with Python FastAPI with Pamela Fox. Pamela is a lecturer for UC Berkeley and is currently teaching courses in computer programming. She's the creator of the computer programming curriculum for Khan Academy, and she's founded GDI Global Chapters and develops a curricula for GDI. She is a long time GDI volunteer, super amazing teacher, and we're really lucky to have her sharing her time with us during the hackathon so that everybody feels like they have all the information that they need to be prepared and ready for the apps everybody's working on. So I'm going to hand it over to Pamela now. She'll share her screen and go ahead and get started. And just a really quick thing for those of you that I know we've been using the system for a couple of days, but it can be confusing. So on the far right-hand side, you'll see this little arrow that gives you the opportunity to chat, look at the attendees, see the rooms. There is a general chat and a session chat. If you click on the word session and then on the chat bubble, oh yeah, I can see that Catherine and Candace are already in here. So that's where we'll be chatting throughout the day. So I will hand it over to Pamela now.
All right. Hello, everyone. So since we have a pretty small group today, please do feel free to ask lots of questions and post things in the chat as we go along. I'll always look over to it. So today we're going to be talking about HTTP APIs. I'm hoping that those of you who are here were able to come to yesterday's, because this does kind of build on top of yesterday's workshop. If you didn't, then just let me know if anything's unclear that I've left out. So we're going to be talking about HTTP APIs. So question is, what are those? So yesterday I talked about how the web works, and the web works over the HTTP protocol. So every time we load a web page, we are sending an HTTP request to a server for that web page, and the server is giving back a response. And we can verify that's the case by opening up our network panel, reloading a page. I have my debugger on right now, sorry. Sorry, I was debugging. You should always remove debuggers before you reload. And then we can see all the network requests that go over the network. I'm just going to go ahead and remove that debugger right now, because you should never have debuggers in your code when you publish it. So momentito, just a quick git push. Okay, all right. And let me also share the slides so all of you can follow along and click the links and all that stuff. So I just put the slides in the chat. So you should be able to open them up if you'd like. Okay, so this is how the web works. It works over HTTP. So an HTTP API is basically a way of using HTTP to get data from a server. So instead of getting a web page or a piece of media for that web page, we're getting data from a server. So in this example here, we might be using a weather API. So we're saying, okay, we want the weather for the zip code of 94530, and we're sending this to the api.example.com domain. So if it has a weather API, then it can send back the data we're looking for. And here it's sent back that the temperature is 70 and the wind is 5. So this is the idea of an API, is to be able to ask another server for some information, some data, and to get back that data. And we do this in a very structured way. So we have like a contract that says, okay, if I, hit up this URL and give you these parameters, then you're going to give me back structured data for my response. So in terms of those responses, a lot of times they're JSON. Increasingly these days, the majority of APIs are responding with JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So if you are familiar with JavaScript, like some of you are, hopefully it looks familiar. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, it's also very similar to a Python dictionary. They're very close to each other. So, JSON is just a nice way of being able to structure data, and that's what most APIs will return. Some APIs will return back XML. XML is a bit more verbose. It also looks like HTML. It uses tags and end tags and that sort of thing. So you will sometimes work with APIs that spit back XML. You might work with RSS, which is a flavor of XML. And I'd almost forgotten about it, except that I don't know if you know, but like Twitter is blowing up right now and kind of falling apart. And so a lot of us have moved over to Mastodon. I don't know if any of you are on Mastodon, but I joined the Fastodon instance. And that all works based off of an XML API, an RSS API. So if you wanted to subscribe to my Mastodon feed, you would actually be subscribing to an XML feed of my posts. Yeah, if you want to join Fastodon, this is where all a lot of Python people are. So it's a pretty good instance, but of course it interacts with all the other instances. But it looks just like TweetDeck. I use the TweetDeck version of the UI. Anyway, that's a plug for if you're looking for an alternative to Twitter. Mastodon is working pretty well. There's a lot of great developers on it. Okay, so yeah, so that that one uses XML. And some APIs might even return back images. So I'll show an example of that. But the vast majority are going to be returning back JSON with the data that you're looking for. Something else to keep in mind with APIs is that they can use either HTTP GET or HTTP POST. So these are two HTTP verbs. So every time we load a web page, we're doing HTTP GET because we're just getting data from a server. And we can specify some parameters to tell that server, to customize that data we get from it. But we're just getting data from the server. If we want to send data to a server, then we use an HTTP POST. And we need to specify the data somehow. We want to do it in a structured way. So a lot of times we could send JSON. So, we could get back JSON, we could send JSON, or we'll use form encoded parameters. And that just looks like this, which is name equals value and name equals value. So when you submit a form, this is actually by default how it gets sent to a server. So this is form encoded parameters. So that's typically how we send something to a server, is either form encoded or with JSON. And lots of APIs do work with POST if you're trying to make data. So if you're using the Twitter API to make a tweet, which you can do. The other day, I used it before Twitter fell apart. I used the Twitter API to programmatically make tweets, which is something you do. That's what Twitter bots do. That's what, in theory, this whole takeover was trying to get rid of, was Twitter bots. But you can make nice Twitter bots. Twitter bots can be useful. So, I made a Twitter bot that used an HTTP POST, posting information to the Twitter API in order to make a tweet. So that's where POST can be useful. So the first thing we're going to do is just play with some APIs. So I'll link the slides again here. There's a bunch of free APIs out there, but these are some free APIs that I found. I asked my followers on Mastodon and Fastodon for their recommendations, and these are some of the ones they came out with. So Ageify tries to guess an age based off a name. Reddit has an API for all of their subreddits, so you can try that if you subscribe to any subreddits, see what that looks like. Here's an API where you can find out your latitude, longitude. So you can put in your zip code and get it out. And then this one, once you know your latitude, longitude, you can find out when the sunrise and sunset is, which is, useful information. Actually, last night, so I live in the Bay Area, last night was the night that the sun set between the two posts of the Golden Gate Bridge. And so it was a beautiful night for photos. So it would have been a good night to know exactly when the sunset was. Okay, so let's play with some APIs for like 5 minutes. And, if you find out anything from the APIs or you just want to post the URLs that you're trying, you can post them in the chat here so we can see what everybody's trying out. Okay, I'm going to try some APIs as well. So Pamela, I already knew this, that Pamela is generally a name associated with the generation before me. So it guesses the age of 61. And that's what I knew from other APIs where I've queried for my name. What about Fox? Does that even get, okay, I'm getting there. Middle name. Susan, also older. Okay, well, my daughter's name is Beverly. Oh, really, really old. She's not that. I guess I just like old school names. What about my new daughter, Sierra? Okay, wow. Well, APIs aren't always right. That's Ageify. Okay, Reddit. So Reddit has these URLs where it has this one's interesting because it actually makes it very easy to figure out the URL. You just take the subreddit URL and then you add top.json to the end of it. So that's the way some websites create their APIs. So here I could change this to like the Python subreddit and then get back all this information here. And you can see this is actually really hard to parse. It's all mashed together. So there's various extensions that you can get that will display it in a pretty way. I filed an issue to tell them to make it. Oh, there you go. This is how you can do it. If you want to see it really pretty, you open up the network panel and you go to the preview tab. And then the preview tab, and you have to click on top.json. The preview tab shows this all in a really pretty way. So here we can navigate through the data. And this is just a way of navigating through JSON in a more, a more structured way than just seeing this blob of JSON on the screen. So this is just JSON. So you can see for a particular post, we can see the author flare, we can see their name. We should be able to find the actual post here. There you go. So there we go. Oh, this is great. A tool to turn your clean Python code into a hideous working mess. Oh, and Candence recommends JSON view. Oh, okay. It wants me to be over 18 to see the Python thing. So yeah, there's also browser extensions. I think I can install browser extensions in Edge. I'm in Edge right now. You could maybe do that. I don't know. But yeah, if you're in Chrome, you could use JSON view. So that's a great suggestion from Candence. So yeah, various ways. So, don't think that you have to be able to look at this and understand this. This is really hard to parse. Use tools and extensions in order to be able to view it. When I don't have an extension, this is my hack. I always go to jsonlint.com. I've been doing this for like a decade. And this is supposed to be just a JSON validator, but I use it in order to prettify JSON when I see it in a not pretty form. So I just paste it in there. And then look at that. It is so pretty. So that's my little JSON viewing hack. So lots of options here. Okay, cool. And then hopefully got to try some other APIs. All right. So let's keep talking about APIs. So so those were free APIs, and free APIs tend not to be the very popular ones, because if your API is popular, you probably don't also want it to be free. So some of these are free, but most of these, actually all of these APIs on this page, these all require an API key. So an API key is something you have to sign up for. And the API provider does this so that they can keep track of your usage, and so that they can charge you money if they need to, so they can turn off your key if they think you're abusing the API. So pretty much once an API becomes legit, it requires an API key. It's just a helpful thing when you are trying to provide an API in order to track developers' usage. So that's why we're not playing with any of these today, because we have to actually sign up for a key. But these are some of the most popular APIs because they're associated with some of the most popular services. So these are all APIs that you could use in order to integrate with these other websites, right? So we could use the Twitter API, like I was talking about, that I was using. We could use the Facebook Graph API. We could use the Instagram API. And all of those, if we wanted to programmatically create posts on those platforms. There's also APIs for productivity software. So if you wanted to programmatically make a Google spreadsheet, that's something I do a lot, actually. I love making Google spreadsheets. You could also do the same for Microsoft products if you wanted to make a Microsoft Word document. There's APIs for all of that. And then there's also APIs that are going to get us data that don't have to do with our own data on a website, right? So if we just need to turn an address into a latitude, longitude, that's public data, right? So that we would use a geocoding API for, and Google Maps has one. We could get Amazon products data, we could get movie data, we could get weather data. So two large classes of APIs. Like one is that you're trying to, integrate with a website that you're already using as a user. And so you use the API in order to programmatically create content for that website. And the other kind of API is providing data that isn't specific to a user. So if any of you have used any APIs like these or other ones, that'd be a cool thing to see in the chat as well. Today, we're not going to use APIs. We're going to build an API. So we're actually going to be API provider. So first, we're going to look at making a simple API in Flask. So if you were at yesterday's workshop, I talked about the Flask framework. It's one of the popular frameworks for making web apps in Python, and it is a possible way of making an API. Actually, I have a survey that I surveyed on Mastodon, so you can do polls on Mastodon too. Let me see how to find my profile. So, because I asked people, there we go. When you're making an HTTP API in Python, what do you use? So it was actually about even between FastAPI and Flask, which are the main things I'm going to show today. And then there's some other options too. So quite a few people are building HTTP APIs in Flask. Ugh, it's hard to say. So many letters, so many acronyms. Okay, so this is what it looks like to make a very simple API in Flask. So let's start here, right? So this is the single API route that I'm defining. So it's going to be at /v1/generate name. That's the path in the URL. And this is the function that's handling that path. And what it does is that it generates a random name from a very short list right now. It would be better to actually get the full list of names from, like the Social Security database. But right now it's just getting it from a short list. And then it's creating a Python dictionary with that name. And then it is turning that into JSON. So it uses the built-in JSON module to turn a Python dictionary into JSON. So that's it. So it's a random name generator. It would be more useful if it actually had more names. So here you can see, you can actually try the API. So I just paste the URL in the browser. And since this is a random generator, every time I reload, I actually get a different name. And then there's the code for it. So that is how we might make a simple API. Now that's not very interesting. We really want more options for our API, more parameters, right? So pretty much all APIs are going to accept parameters in order to, modify something about the data that comes back. So here's our V2 API. It takes a parameter, a query parameter. So in Flask, the way to get a query parameter is to say request.args.get, and then we specify the name of the query parameter. And if it sees a query parameter, then it filters the names using a Python list comprehension. So it's looking to see which names start with the letter that got passed in. And then everything else is the same. So let's try this one out. So this time we can add a query parameter. So I'm going to type a question mark to say that I'm about to have query parameters on this URL. And then it starts with equals n. So now every time I get a name, it should start with n. If it does, we could change this to m. Now it's only m names. Now, if we change this to j, what's going to happen? We get an error. So we really should test our API better to make sure we cover all the cases here. So I was saying, this is a very simple API. It doesn't have, full error handling. There's a lot of ways that it can be improved. but we're showing the basics of being able to pass in a query parameter, which is what we want in an API. Okay, so what is that API missing? A lot. Error checking, as we saw, right? So it could check, what happens if you, it should handle if the letter, there's no data for that. But it could also check to see whether a parameter should be required. Like, should you have to put in starts with, or is that optional? What if I put in starts with like 1, the number 1? Well, then I get another error, right? So it starts with, does it need to be a string? Can it be an integer? So there's all kinds of error checking that we could do in order to let people know that they're using our API correctly or not. And it's really nice if you can provide good errors, because then that helps developers figure out how to use your API. It's also missing documentation. So if it's a public-facing API or even internal API, it should have documentation that makes it clear how it should be used. So those, to me, are attributes of a great API. So that is where FastAPI comes in. Catherine mentioned curiosity about FastAPI. FastAPI is very cool. I, started using it in the last few months, and it warms my heart every time I use it. So it is a Python framework designed specifically for building HTTP APIs. That is its thing. And why is it called fast? Well, it's both fast to make an API. It takes care of a lot of things for you that would otherwise have taken you time. So it actually auto-generates the documentation. So that's something that in the past, it would be a lot of effort to generate documentation. So my first job was on the Google Maps API, and I worked on updating that documentation and generating it, and it was a lot of effort. But FastAPI auto-generates the documentation for you, just as long as you follow the conventions for how you describe your API. And then it's also fast to execute. So it's, performance is something that it does, they work on in the FastAPI framework, and they try to make it be fairly speedy. So let's see how to use FastAPI. So here we have the same API, but done in FastAPI. So this time I'm importing FastAPI, and I'm creating a FastAPI app. And then I have a very similar route decorator here that says this is for the generate name path. And then here I have the actual function that's going to handle it. So the difference here is that you notice this function parameter here starts with, and I'm going to point out a few things about this, is that this uses Python types. And FastAPI is built off of Python types now, or type annotations. Type annotations are purely optional in Python. It's something that they added to the language as an optional thing that can be used by tools. It is not enforced by the language. So if you mess up the type, and you're not going to have broken code, but it's something that tools can use and let you know if something is working, and they can add some extra features around those types. So this is a Python type annotation. So it says this is the name of the parameter. This is what we would normally have in a Python function. But then to add a type annotation, we say :string. So this is saying that this is a string. And then we say equals none. This is giving it a default value. And so when we do this, we're telling we're telling FastAPI that, hey, this API path takes a query parameter starts with that needs to be a string, but is optional. So by saying equals none, we're saying this is an optional parameter. They don't have to specify it. So all of this is giving FastAPI the information it needs in order to make that documentation. So we'll see this reflected in the documentation. And then FastAPI also always outputs JSON. So you can see here, I didn't have to import JSON or do the JSON.dumps because FastAPI just does that for you. So that's another thing that FastAPI does for us. So let's check this out. Okay, so here it is. These are the auto-generated docs. I love these. This is what makes me so happy about FastAPI. So these are all auto-generated. So we can expand and see this generate name path, and we see the parameters that it takes. and we can see, we can actually try it out. So I click try it out, and then I can say starts with N, and then I say execute, and it will execute that. So it'll create the whole URL, and it'll show the response body. It'll show the full response headers. It'll give you a curl command. It's trying to make it really easy for us to figure out how to interact with this API. So this is, chef's kiss. What I love about FastAPI is this documentation. Okay, so how do we actually use FastAPI locally? Let me actually get my code open locally. Let's see. Yeah. So we put all that code in the file. We install the requirements. So for FastAPI, we need the FastAPI module, of course. But to run it locally, we also need a server. So FastAPI doesn't have any sort of server built in. So it recommends using the UVcorn server. So we also install this server. And then we need to run the server. So I'll show that. That's when it's still loading here. Something also to mention about FastAPI is FastAPI is built off the asynchronous way of doing servers. So it's built off of ASGI, as it's called. And so UVcorn is a way of running this. One thing as well to point out here is that it says async def. So that's another thing about FastAPI is that it's built upon the new support in Python for asynchronous functions. So, and that's like a whole topic in its own, and actually not something I'm much an expert in. I'm still learning about that, but that is why you're going to see async here, and why we need to use this UVcorn server, because it's built to be able to handle asynchronous function handlers like that. Actually, FastAPI has a really nice explanation about async if you're curious. It has all these amazing illustrations. So if you are curious about async in Python, and it's similar to async in JavaScript, you can read through that tutorial there. Okay, so let's see here. Got my API in here. Okay, so that's the one I was just showing. And how do I run this? I use the UVcorn. Okay, run that. All right. Now I open that up. And here it says not found. This is from FastAPI because we haven't gone to the specific route. So I add the route there, and I can see the response. I can also go to the docs and see the docs here. So there we go. So any questions on everything I just showed about FastAPI? Should have little hand emojis. Okay. Well, we're going to spend a few minutes now seeing if you're all able to just do what I did and get it running. So similar to yesterday, I've set this up so it can use code spaces, but you can also check this out locally and try it locally, whatever you prefer. You can just do exactly what I just did with running the server. And then if you get that running, then I put some more suggestions here for how you could build on the API. So starting with just adding more names to the list, and then you could try adding another API parameter. Then you'll have to add it to the function parameters. And you could also try adding a whole new route. So those are some ideas for you. But the first step is just to try to get that running. So we'll spend, I'll give you 10 minutes, and you can also use that for any bio breaks. So we'll resume at 11:45. I will be still sitting here and waiting to see if you have any questions in the chat. I just put the slide URL in the chat so you can go directly to what we're working on now. Okay, we'll come back now, but hoping to get more folks successful with getting it running. Yeah, I guess the thing about code spacing is that it can take a while to load the code space, but then once it does load, it does tend to work well, across different systems since it's not as dependent on your system setup. So I should just ask you to load the code space, when we all just get together first. Because when you're trying to get something working locally, then you have, you've got different Pythons installed, packages competing with each other. So it can be a lot more problematic. There is something I want to show. So these URLs here. So here I've got this URL running in code spaces, right? This is how I was testing the API. And so let me get that one working. So if I pasted this URL right now in the chat, you probably wouldn't be able to view it. You'd probably get an authentication error. So by default, GitHub restricts these ports to only, being for the person who made them. And that's good because if you're working on, something private, you don't want people just being able to navigate to your test port. But if you do want to make them public, you can change the visibility by going to, so when you're in code spaces, you can go to ports, and then you can go to find the one you want to make public, and you go to the visibility column, and then you change port visibility to public. Okay, so now I think you should be able to actually see my URL. Yeah, I was just able to view it in a private window. So you could try clicking on again and you might actually see it. Now, this is still not like a proper place to host your app. This is still basically local development. It just happens to be on a GitHub URL because it's only going to work as long as that uvicorn command is running. It's only going to work as long as your code space is currently up. So this is a very ephemeral thing. But if you're just trying to pair program with someone, trying to show a colleague something briefly, then you can change the port visibility so that other people can actually hit up that test server you've got running. So that I think is actually pretty cool. All right. So let's see. I wanted to show another example of an API that I made with FastAPI. Have any of you used scikit-learn to do data science, like to make models? Anyone from data science, data analysis? I think at least one of you, but we'll see if I'm right. Yes. Yeah. So Heidi. Yeah. So scikit-learn is a Python package in order to make machine learning models. So I used it the other day to make a regression model that predicts salary based off the Stack Overflow survey data. So I wanted to make an API out of that model so that you could enter in parameters and then see what the model would predict for you. So I used FastAPI to do this, and I thought it was just really, really fun. So the first thing I do is I load in the model. So this is basically loading in the model that I made before. This is what's called a pickled file. So a pickle is like a way of storing a Python object for later. So we pickle it, put it in a file, and then we can unpickle it later. So here I'm unpickling it, loading that model back in. And then here is the actual FastAPI path. So this one has a bunch of parameters, and these are the same parameters that I fed into the machine learning model. So, number of years coding professional, your education level, whether you're a developer all the time, and the country you're from. So then I create a new NumPy array with those values that gets passed in. And then I use the model to predict based on those values, and then finally return it back. So I'll show you what that looks like with the FastAPI docs. So loading. Okay, so here's the docs. And now you can see how nice it is that it generates the docs, because this is an API that has a lot more parameters. And we can try this out too. So I could say like, oh, I've been programming for 10 years. I've been programming for, 5 years professionally. I have a master's degree. I'm a developer. I'm from the United States. In the United States, this makes a big difference, the country. So then I can execute that API and get back the estimated salary. And I can see the very long query parameter that I could use to issue it. So now you can see how helpful it is to have this sort of API documentation where you can, come up with the URLs. Because as an API gets more complex, it's harder to just type the URL correctly in the browser and get it all right. Here it's even got drop downs, right? And this is something that's a little bit fancier, but you can specify, this API parameter can only take one of some possible values, and then you'll get these drop downs in the documentation. And if we passed it anything else, we would actually get an error. So I can change it. So I'll like change the country, right? And then this is actually an error that said the value is not a valid member. These are all the ones that permitted. So we get these detailed errors for free just by using FastAPI. So I thought this was a really cool use of FastAPI. Okay, and so now let's talk about actually how we would host this API so that people could hit this up, and have a real host for it that was hosting it all the time. So when you're thinking about hosting, these are the sort of things to consider. Is how much traffic do you expect to get for this API? Like, do you expect it to go viral? Is it just a little toy thing? Is it just for your own household? Do you expect it to get zero traffic? Like, what's the range of traffic that you might reasonably expect? Of course, it's hard to predict things, but you think through this. And then also think about how variable will the traffic be? Will it generally be a lot of traffic, or will it, sometimes be zero and sometimes be a lot? Do you need scale to zero? Like, is it possible that this API will have no traffic? And that's very possible if you're doing something like a hobby project, a learning project, a hackathon project. At some point, it might have zero traffic because you're not necessarily doing marketing or actually intending it for it to get real use, but you might still want to have a host for it, but you don't want to have to pay for an API that's getting zero traffic. So this is a big consideration: is if nobody is using your API at all, do you need to, is there a way you can just not pay for it? And there are hosting options where you have scale to zero, where you can just not pay for it. And that's something you might want to look for if you need to scale to zero. Related to that is, what's your budget? Like, do you actually want to pay money to host this API? Or is this, if it's for the hackathon and for a hobby, maybe you don't want to have to. Is it public facing or is it internal? There's many internal APIs. So you could be developing an API for one part of your company to interact with another part of your company. That's a very valid use of APIs. And then if it is public facing, then how will you manage API use? Are you going to have keys? Is it somehow going to be a free-for-all, and that's okay? These are just all the things to consider about when you're thinking about hosting an API. So in terms of hosting on Azure, so I work for Microsoft now, so I am familiar with how to host on Microsoft's web services, which are known as Azure, but Google and Amazon and other places have similar hosting options. But on Azure, there are many ways of hosting things. What I would recommend for an API is to use one of the platform as a service options, because they'll take care of a lot of the sort of things we might want for an API, like scaling down to zero. So Azure App Service and Azure Functions are both good options for hosting an API. So for this one, I'm going to show Azure Functions, since I showed Azure App Service yesterday, but you could totally use Azure App Service as well. So what does it look like to host a FastAPI in Azure Functions? Okay, so if we get it deployed there, then when our browser makes an HTTP request to an Azure function, then it's going to go to that function. The function's going to execute the code, and then it's going to spit back the response. So that's the main thing that's happening here. But there are also some associated things that we need if we're going to use Azure Functions. So we need an app service plan, which says how to scale. We need a storage account to actually store the code because it's actually, running our code in the cloud. So we pretty much always need a storage account. And then we might want some analytics as well. So in terms of how I deploy, I like to use the Azure Dev CLI. So I'll actually show it because I'm in here. Okay, so let me make this bigger. Let me make this bigger. Okay. So here I'm in Codespaces. I could also do this locally, but I like Codespaces. So what we're going to do is use the AZD command and type AZD up. So I've made this repository work well with this AZD command, which is a way of getting a bunch of resources made in the Azure cloud. So it is currently, it's checking out what resource it needs to make. So it's coming up with a plan for what it needs to make. So it's like, oh, I need to make a function. I need to make a storage plan. I need to make an analytics account. And now it's actually provisioning them. And so you can see everything it made, and it actually already made these things. Or is this the one that broke? We'll find out soon. I've got like 10 versions of this deployed in various places, so it's hard for me to keep track. But it creates all these things, and it should, once it's done creating them, then it'll actually deploy the code, and then we'll be able to view it in the portal. So let me go to the portal. Here's my Azure portal. So let's see. So this one is one of these FastAPI functions. So this is one I deployed earlier, and you can see it made the function app. That's the main thing we care about, but it also made some other things. So here's the function app, and here's the URL for it. So I can go to this URL and then generate name. Okay, so that works. And this is a URL that is definitely publicly viewable. That's the way I've set it up, so that it should be publicly viewable and usable on the web. And this is a URL that you could hit up at any time. Since this is hosted on Azure Functions, that's what's known as a serverless technology. So that means that Azure will, it'll when it gets a request for this function, if there's not already a server that's ready to respond, it'll spin up a new server for you and respond to that. And then if there are any more requests come in right after that, it'll use that same server. And then if it needs to, if there's getting like a lot of traffic, it'll spin up more and more servers. But then if it sees that it's getting no traffic at all, it'll spin down that server. So if it's been a while since somebody has hit up this URL, it's possible that it actually needs to spin up a server from scratch. So that's what's known as the cold start time. So if you're ever using any serverless technology like AWS Lambda or or Azure Functions, or I think it's called Google Functions, they all have this aspect where they take some amount of time to cold start if it's been a while since anybody's hit up that function, because they're actually spinning up a server. So that's the bad thing about that is that there's some startup time. The good thing is that means you're generally not paying for time that your API is not being used. So from a budget perspective, that's really nice. So these functions, serverless platforms, tend to be the most inexpensive options because they do get spun down when they're not in use. So there we go. There's the function. Okay. So cool. That's deployed. Oh, look. And then my deploy did actually finish over here. So this is even on a different, see, I just deploy it everywhere all the time. So this is to a different URL because I specified a different URL this time. So this URL will also work the same. So the thing is that you can deploy it, you could have multiple servers that you deploy it to. Everyone on your team might deploy to a different staging server, and then you might have a final server that only, some people are allowed to deploy to. That's your primary server. So there's lots of ways you could set that up. Okay. Now, there's still things that are missing from this hosted API, and it bothers me as somebody who works with APIs. So, what is it missing? Well, we don't have any way of doing it. We don't have any subscription key mechanism. So, all of you can just hit up my API and not specify a key. And I don't have a way of tracking, who is who, who's hitting it up. Can I, limit per key? So it's missing subscription keys. Related to that, it's missing any sort of quotas or rate limiting. So if one of you wanted to write a script to hit up my API, thousands of times in a second, you could do that. And then my poor budget, I would actually have to pay money. Right now, I'm not really paying anything because no one's really using it. But if you did write a script to hit up my API a huge number of times, then that'd be problematic. I don't want that unless that's a legitimate use, right? And this is once again why we want subscription keys, so we can see like, oh, we have somebody using this a lot. We should charge them money to do that. Related, it also doesn't have caching. So if everybody's just hitting up, passing in the same query parameter, why go through the effort to recompute that name if I already know what I want to spit out? So caching can be a good thing. CORS handling, if I want to be able to use this API from a website, IP blocking, if I want to block a particular IP that's being nefarious. So these are all aspects that you might want in an API. And if you're an API provider company, these are the things you have to worry about. And when I was at Google Maps API, we actually were like coming up with these mechanisms from scratch. Because we were one of the first very popular APIs. So we had to come up with, how do we do quotas? How do we do keys, right? But the cool thing is, so many people make APIs these days that Azure and other places make it easy to add all of these on top of a service. So we can actually add an Azure API management service on top of the Azure function, and that can provide all of those features I just talked about. And you just like click a box and you're like, oh, I want quotas. And bam, you have quotas. I think this is so cool because I remember at Google Maps just how much effort it was to create all these API functions. And now you can just get it. I just love it. So, so in fact, if you did, so by deploying, so when I did just deploy this API here, it did actually make an API management service as well. So I can go to that, and that also has a URL associated with it. So I can make it so that all of the requests came through here. And if I go to this one, now you're actually going to get an error code that says, oh, you're missing a subscription key. So here we've got subscription keys. So I can go to my keys and say, okay, let's see, where are my subscriptions? So subscriptions, I'm going to add a subscription for, tester. And here we go. And now we have a key for this. Okay. And I think I just specify it like here. Is that going to work? Subscription key. Oh, it's invalid. Oh, no. Oh, because this is actually, wait, which one are we on right now? Okay. Tester. I think this one should, let's see. Show hide keys. There we go. Oh, good question. So API, I actually had it to add a slide with what's an API. So it's a great question. API stands for Application Programming Interface. So it means this is the way in which one program can interface with another program. So it's like the way in which two programs can talk with each other. So we also talk about like the Python API, which is like how you can call Python functions. But when we say an HTTP API, we mean how can one computer talk to another computer over HTTP? What is the interface, right? So for this example, the interface is that if you specify /generate name and you put in a key, then this computer will respond with data. So it's like a promise, a contract between two computers about how they can get data from each other. Great question. I did mean to do that slide. Okay, so now you can see we have the fact that you have to pass in a key. So, and I can make different keys for all of you. There, I just shared that key. We also have other policies that I added. So I'll show you what else got added here. So these are all the things I added. So I added caching, I added rate limiting, and I added cores. There's other policies I could add as well. So you could see these. So there's the IP filtering, limiting usage, lots of cool stuff. Unfortunately, some of these do require you to pay more money. So I've set this up so this all works on the free tier and isn't gonna cost any money. But some of this stuff you do have to pay money for, which is understandable. Like you have to upgrade the pricing tier. Still not, you don't have to pay that much, but more than free. One sec. Okay. So the next exercise is actually trying to deploy the API. Let's see if we actually can do that. So this has a few more steps. Like one of them is signing up for an Azure account. So I've never tried doing this in a workshop, so I don't know how much time, I can't remember how much time that actually takes. And then if you've got the project open in Codespaces, that's already set up in order to be able to use the AZD tool. Otherwise, you install the AZD tool, and then you just run AZD up. If you're not logged in yet, then it prompts you to log in. And if you are logged in, then you're good, but it'll probably prompt you. I'll show if I did AZ log out. I'm just going to log out so you can see what it would look like if I wasn't logged in. So in Codespaces, I have to do this device login. So I'm going to do it in my personal account. Less steps. So I have to enter this code. And then pick my account. I say, yes, I'm trying to sign in. And then that's done. So that's after I already have an Azure account. Before you do that, you'd want to have an Azure account. So that logged me in, and then it starts doing the process again. Okay, let me link to this slide again and spend, I guess, 7 minutes to see if you're able to deploy. And I will once again be in the chat, able to answer questions. And after that, I'm going to show a few more demos and talk about a little more thing, discuss a few more things about APIs. This is also a time where you can take a bio break. Okay, so I know at least a few people have started running the AZD up command. Yeah, one thing I didn't mention is it does take a lot of time the first time that it is, deploying something because it has to create all those resources. And luckily with functions, there's not that many resources, but there's still, a couple different things it has to make. So let's see here. It took me this one here took me 5 minutes to do it all. Once you've created those resources, then subsequent AZD ups are fairly fast. And you can also, if you know you're only changing code, then you can just run AZD deploy, and that just does the deploy step. So AZD up is actually doing two things. It's first provisioning all these resources. That's like making all these types of Azure services in your account. And then once it's done doing that provisioning, then it's deploying the code, which means actually taking the code and putting it on the Azure server. So once you've made all these things, if your architecture stays the same, then all you need to do subsequently is just deploy. So after I've done an up, a lot of times if I'm just changing the code, just adding a query parameter or whatever, then I'll just do the deploy. And this also, you can see it's still doing deploying. Deploying does take a few minutes too, because it's literally taking your code and bundling it up and sending it to the Azure servers and restarting the server. So this takes some time too, but it's less time than the time it takes to create all these services in your account. And there you go. So that only was like a minute, I think. So, if I change the code and I want to see it live on the site, I just type AZD deploy. Yeah, and someone mentioned, I guess the Azure free account does require a credit card on file, although I think maybe, did the placebo card work? So I don't know if placebo cards work there, but if you're a student, like from a university, I don't think you need to have a credit card on file, but otherwise it does require a credit card, which is a shame. Okay. All right, cool. So if any of you do manage to get that deployed, do ping me your URL on Slack later. I've got the Slack open here. All right. So deployment. Okay. Here's another demo that I wanted to show. This is, I mentioned, earlier that an API could return an image. So this is an example of an API that returns an image. I built this using Azure Functions, so it's not using Fast or Flask at all. It's just getting parameters and writing out an image and then responding with that image. I just wanted to show that this is possible because you might have some use case where you want to respond with images, like to generate memes or maps or something like that. So I can show you how I use this. It's just to generate icons. So this just generates very simple icons that I can then use to replace the really weird icons that I don't understand on my desktop. So that's what this one does here. So this is a website that's calling the Azure function. So I'll show the code. So once you've made a function and an API, you could call it from a website. So you can see here, I'm calling it and passing in the subscription key, and it is creating an image, and I just put that in the web page. So this is just to show that you can call APIs from websites if that's the sort of thing you want to do. A little bit more on APIs. Okay, so all the demos we showed were all using get with query parameters, but you may want to make an API where you use post, like if you're having an API where somebody is creating data. So with FastAPI, if you're creating a post API, it is a little bit different because it's not taking query parameters anymore. So for making a post API, you actually have to create a class that inherits from base model, and then you describe all the pieces of data using Python types as attributes of that class. And then that class gets passed in as a parameter. And then here we can see that it says .post. So if you are making an API with post, it is a slightly different way of describing the data, and you can learn more in the documentation. Another thing to consider is that if you're using the Django framework for your website and you want an API for your website, so you want an API for people to be able to interact with the models in your database, then you might consider just using the Django REST framework, because that is built to create APIs on top of Django. That's what it's built for. So if you're already using Django, it might be a lot of effort to use FastAPI on top of Django. Instead, just use the Django REST framework. And that's designed to make it super easy to just plug it into your Django app and boom, you've got a REST API for your database. And here I realize I'm using some acronyms that I haven't explained again. So CRUD means create, read, update, delete. So a CRUD API is an API that lets you create new entities, read existing entities, update existing entities, and delete entities. These are like the 4 things you might want to do to things in a database. So that's what a CRUD API is, and that's what you might want if you have a Django database. And then REST stands for representational state transfer, and it's just the idea of an API that is interacting with objects, and each object has an ID, and once again each object can have CRUD operations on it. So those are some acronyms there that you might encounter when making APIs. All right, so I actually have a little bit of time left for questions, so if there's anything you are wondering about in terms of APIs and how to build APIs, how to use APIs. I just generally love APIs. I also love APIs from JavaScript. I happen to, do most stuff in Python right now, but my first love was JavaScript. Actually, my first love was Java. But anyway, I have a lot of loves. If you have any questions, I'll just keep rambling until you ask something. All right. Oh, yeah, so I am on the Slack. So I've been paying attention to the help desk channel and the Hack for Health channel. So yeah, you could ping me on Slack. I have availability during the day, but not on weekends and weeknights because of babies and stuff that I have. But yeah, so you can either post in the help desk channel or you could ping me on Slack. Cool. All right, then. And yeah, I'll keep the slides up. I believe Katie said that all of these sessions are recorded. So those recordings should become available, because somebody asked about that yesterday. And Katie said we send out every recording from our sessions after the full event. Let me know if there's something you want to view sooner and I'll pull it early. Oh, okay. Okay, so you can ping Katie if you want a recording earlier. Cool. Oh, and Heather, hi. All right. Sure. Thanks, everyone. Happy hacking. Look forward to seeing what you all come up with. Hope to see some APIs or Python representation happening, or JavaScript or anything. Just want to see what you make. Okay. Bye, everyone.